Hello. So as I kind of briefly mentioned in the previous session, so I'm a faculty member. I'm in the Department of Psychology with the Behavioral Neuroscience area. And so this session is going to focus on how to choose a program, the admission process, crafting an application, any questions that are related to that. Some of these questions sort of came up in the first session. There's a little bit of an overlap. Um, but we can talk about those as well. But I'm also joined by two graduate students in the program, McKenna and Ilya. And so we can, what I'm going to try to do is um, throw out some questions that we've had sent in, answer some, maybe Joanne can help me answer some that maybe are best suited for the faculty members, but then some direct towards our graduate students. And so we'll kind of split it that way. And then if you have any other questions, you can throw them in the chat. So I'm going to first, one of the kind of the big questions is like, when do you start applying? When should you start thinking about this? And I'm going to let the students answer this question first, because then the next questions are kind of what are faculty members looking for? And I think that can be best answered by myself and or Joanne. So does either one of you want to take that and maybe base it on your experience or what you would have done differently, about the application process?
Sure, I can go ahead first and I'll send it off to McKenna. First of all, hi, I'm Aaliyah. I am a third year in the cognitive neuroscience area at UT Austin, I guess transitioning to my fourth year. In terms of the application timeline, I think I started around this point actually. Mainly, I started at this point reaching out to faculty that I was interested in working with to get a sense about whether they were actually accepting students. So that's something that maybe has been talked about in other sessions, but is a very important piece of the puzzle. You don't want to submit an application, spend the money, time, and energy for someone who doesn't have the funding or isn't really recruiting a student. So I started reaching out around July, August. Some faculty said they don't know what their funding situation was, but it was a great kind of first introduction to our conversations. And then around September, I had a finalized list of who I was applying for. And that's when I started actually crafting statements and personalizing them and all that kind of fun stuff. So I'll pass it over to McKenna.
Hi, I'm McKenna. I just finished my first year and I'm in the clinical area. So also if there are specific questions about that, I think earlier on we were talking about in general some of the other areas, but some of the clinical requirements are a little bit different. But yeah, I think similar to Aaliyah, I think around the summer I had a longer list of programs, and then I probably waited until September to kind of send out those emails to see who was accepting students, and then was able to get a shorter list that then in October and November, I was doing all the personal statements, getting transcripts. Letters of recommendation is another one that kind of earlier on you want to think about, just to make sure that you can give your recommenders plenty of time to write your letter. And then, yeah, I think having a solid draft of your personal statement so that you can then specialize it to each of the programs is one of the bigger aspects to be thinking about.
All right, thank you for that. So what I wanted to talk about is kind of from all of the questions that were submitted, a couple stood out to me that were related. One is, what are you really looking for, or what are one or two main characteristics that faculty members are looking for, and what can you do to kind of enhance your application. From kind of my perspective, one of the biggest things that I look for in applications is research experience. So really coming, and it doesn't have to be years and years and years of research experience, but having a solid foundation in research experience. And so if that's something that you feel like is missing, that is what you really would want to work on enhancing in your application, whether it's during a gap year, which is, Christine mentioned this earlier, that's what some people do during their gap years, or during your time in college. In addition to that, one of the things that I really look for, and it's not necessarily, it can be conveyed through your personal statement, but particularly during interviews, is this kind of innate curiosity and drive for the science. So there has to be, and that has really kind of carried through their research experience for their undergrad. So really, wanting to be there because they have that curiosity and that drive to answer these questions. So those are kind of the things that stand out to me. I don't know if you have anything to add, Joanne, to that.
No, I second that sentiment 100%. So I know there are, some, and, I've been in this shoes, anxiety about GRE, GPA, like what we typically think of numbers. And, it gives you some idea of what the students are capable of doing. But more than anything, at least from my perspective, and I think a lot of PhD programs that are especially on research track, it is very important for both students and faculty members to have the sort of a good match on the research interest. And also from your perspective, if you've never done research in your life and you're jumping straight into a PhD program that's very, very research intensive, you don't know whether that's something you actually want to do. So you want to have some idea of what it's like to do research and also what topics you're interested in. And I'm not trying to scare you that you need to know exactly what type of research you want to do, but you need to have some idea, and that you need to know that, research is something that really gets you up in the morning, and that's something that you want to do. Because without that, a PhD program can be very, very depressing. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And that's something that I look for in taking students in, that do they have sort of this curiosity and drive in doing research. There is a question actually that just came through. Is it wise to email every advisor of interest before applying? What were your experiences? So I think maybe the grad student can just address this question.
Yeah, so I reached out via email, I think, to almost everyone that I was interested in applying to. I think a lot of the programs on the websites, they'll sometimes list if the person is taking a student, but I was finding some of them would be out of date. So it'd be like 2 years ago they were taking a student. So I think it was really important to clarify that. And I also had a couple of instances where I emailed and said, hey, here's what I'm interested in researching. I see on your website that you do XYZ. And then the faculty member would get back to me and be like, hey, that's cool. We've actually moved on to now we're working on whatever. So maybe like so-and-so is a better fit. So I think it was good to just touch base with people. Some people didn't respond. Obviously people are very busy, but I think it was helpful. And I got a lot of people who said, oh, actually, like we're doing something different now, or, oh yes, we are doing this, like maybe it would be a good fit. So for me, it was most people that I reached out to.
Yeah, I totally second that sentiment. Something that maybe people know or don't know, graduate school, your training is so defined by your PI and that individual person that you're going to be working with. It's sometimes about the program, and the program matters, but the program doesn't really define your training and your experience. So you really, really want to find a good fit. And sometimes the best way to do that is to reach out, both for research reasons, like McKenna said, to be like, this is what I'm interested in researching. Are you still doing this? Are you accepting students? What's the process like? But also sometimes the way they respond tells you a lot about what kind of mentor they might be. Sometimes they respond with a short, like, yes. Sometimes they'll be like, well, this is a really good fit. Here's generally what I'm expecting from students. What are you interested in? Maybe let's talk about it. So that kind of email exchange, that back and forth can really set you up to be really excited to work with specific individuals or less excited to work with specific individuals. So I think kind of the process of finding that perfect fit begins with the email from your end as well. So there really isn't a downside, in my opinion, to reaching out and starting those conversations, both for time and energy on your part and for just learning as much as you possibly can about this person you're going to be dedicating 6 years of your life to, or even longer potentially if it's a successful collaboration long term.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
If I may add, from the faculty's point of view, and I've been there, you know, I didn't know what I was doing when I was applying to grad school. I cannot believe I'm here. But so from faculty's point of view, it is absolutely okay for you to email us. We may not write back to you, but it is absolutely okay for you to write to us. And if there are a list of faculty members, the labs, the research that you are really interested in, write back again. You send them an email, and if you don't hear back in a couple of weeks, so you can wait a month or so, it is absolutely okay for you to send a follow-up email saying, hey, just checking in. And like what Aaliyah was saying, the interaction that you get from the faculty member can also tell you what that person is like. You may never hear back from them for whatever various reasons, but sometimes, we get a lot of emails and we forget. So it is absolutely okay for you to send a follow-up email too. Sorry, Caitlin.
No, but I would say when you do email, make sure you've done your homework. It doesn't have to be hours and hours, but I will also tell you from perspective, if someone emails me and they are wrong about what I do, I won't even consider, or entertaining that possibility. So, and that's just, I think, showing a little bit of respect. And if you are truly interested in that person, you will already know, but make sure that when you email that person, you have looked into what they do, that you can actually, speak to that person's expertise, because it's very easy to kind of read through the lines and be like, well, this person probably just did a cursory, glance and is just emailing a bunch of people. And, I actually think like earlier is better. So earlier than September. And if you're really interested in building that kind of relationship, earlier is better. Some people have a better sense of what their funding may be. And there are conferences, at least, from kind of my discipline, there are conferences that precede the application deadlines that, if you are attending them, you could meet, the faculty members that you're interested in and, have a conversation before you submit the applications. So I think earlier is always better, but make sure that, you're crafting the kind of an appropriate email.
So there's a question that came through, and I think this could be sort of a broad interest for many students. So I plan on doing schizophrenia research and clinical work, and I'm wondering how specific I should be when looking for school faculty who are involved in that sort of work. How far away from that specific field should I be willing to move while choosing a program?
Aaliyah, do you want to go first?
I was just going to give a broad overview that I think in some degree it depends on you. Your training, again, is going to be almost 90% defined by that head investigator that you're working with or that faculty. So if you're like schizophrenia or nothing, like this is 100% what I want to do for the rest of my life, I would really advise you to find someone who's actively working in that field, because you will not have as many opportunities to do that kind of research or have that kind of training otherwise. But if this is something you're really interested in, but maybe you're interested in also adjacent things, also as a graduate student who came in with a really specific research interests change. So if you're like really interested in a specific person, a specific technique, you can be a bit more flexible and a bit more broad. So I would encourage you to think about it in kind of a specific sense as like, this is who I'm going to be working with most closely. So yes, the research interest is really interesting to me, but maybe there's other things about them I'm really interested in. And also I would totally advise you to look at programs that have maybe 1 or 2 people who do something that you're really interested in. So you have a bit of a sampling in case that topic is no longer interesting, or you want to collaborate with someone, you want to be co-advised. Opening that room is always better. But as of right now, I would be as specific as you can without sacrificing the quality of the school or if you're like not interested in a specific geographic location or something. That would be my 2 cents on that.
Yeah, I think Aaliyah is absolutely right. And kind of, as she said earlier, I mean, you want to keep close to your interests, but you were going to be working with this person for a while. And once you graduate, it's not like that person is going to disappear from your life, right? You're probably going to need letters of recommendation. It's a mentoring relationship that continues beyond your PhD. And so you could go into a lab that does exactly what you want to do with schizophrenia, but the mentor may not be great, may not be a good fit. And it is likely that you really may not enjoy that research. But on the flip side, you could find a really good mentor, you have a great kind of fit, and maybe it's more peripheral to your original interest, but it could be a great experience. And it doesn't mean that what you do in your PhD is going to dictate what your focus is on the rest of your life. So I think it's a mix of the two. I don't think you want to have a full departure from your interests, but yeah, I think you don't want to. You shouldn't sacrifice much, but there's it's a equation that you want to balance. These different components. McKenna, do you have anything to add? I don't know what especially since this individual seems to be interested in clinical work as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo everything you both have said about the research side of it. And then with the clinical aspect, if you're looking to also do clinical work, I think a lot of the programs, we obviously all follow the same APA requirements, but one piece of it that's helpful to look into for programs is what kind of practicum placements they do. So if you were really interested in, maybe it's just schizophrenia research, but if you really want to work with that population clinically, then I would look to see if they have information about what kind of sites the programs will have you do your placements at during your graduate education, to make sure that you can get experience if there are particular populations you want to work with.
McKenna, since you are here, let me throw another question that came through, which is, if you want to be a practicing clinician with PhD in clinical psychology, do you need to go to grad school in the state that you want to practice in, for the license?
My understanding is you don't. So I think that you can go to any state, and then your internship sometimes will end up in a different state. And then afterwards, I think it depends on what you want to do, that you, for instance, I'm interested in neuropsych. So I know that is then fellowship afterwards. And then you do a whole separate, like your board, licensing. That might have to be in the state that you're then going to practice in, but the program itself does not have to be in that state, to my understanding.
I was going to throw out a question, kind of before that question, unless anyone else wants to add to that. But we were talking about kind of fit with the advisor, and so one of the questions that I thought the McKenna and Aaliyah could maybe answer is, when you were doing this, what were some of the things that you were looking for in an advisor, and how, do you have any tips for finding an advisor that's kind of the right fit for you?
Yeah, I can start. So for me, obviously the research interest is an important aspect to it. So you want to find someone who's doing generally the work that you're interested in, but also for me, it was important to have someone who is understanding of, okay, here are my interests now, and here's my goals at this point in time, but knowing that those things can change and helping facilitate that. So I think finding someone who is in the field that you're interested in, but also, yeah, has the willingness to kind of help guide you as those interests may change. And then generally too, you want to kind of get an idea of how independent they expect you to be. Obviously in graduate school, a lot of your work is independent, but talking to current graduate students, as we talked about in an earlier session, is really helpful to get an idea of what their mentorship style is like. So do they like to do weekly meetings? Do they contact you every 3 months? You know, are they responsive via email? Things like that. So finding someone who kind of meets you where you're at, and in terms of what you need for frequency of meetings and responsiveness.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything McKenna said. I will also add that both research topic and techniques can be independently and equally important. So if you're really interested in, I was really interested in neuroimaging computational modeling. So that was a specific appeal to some of the labs that I was looking into. Some practical tips in terms of assessing the lab is also looking at publication records of graduate students in particular. So how frequently are they publishing? How frequently are they first authors? Because sometimes that just depends on like the structure of the lab. I would also really encourage talking to graduate students in particular, not so much also talk to the PI obviously, but getting a sense from the graduate students what the dynamic is, how comfortable they are providing feedback to their advisor, how realistic it is that the advisor actually takes into account the feedback that students give them. Because this is such an interpersonal and mentorship based relationship, the reality of it is that it's going to look different from grad student to grad student, because that's just how humans work. So it's really important to get a different sampling of different types of dynamics. How accommodating is the PI? One question that I've heard people ask that I think has yielded really good outcomes is asking both the graduate student and the advisor what they think their role is in this mentorship dynamic. Some advisors will answer that question in a very technical way, like my role is to teach you how to do X, Y, and Z. Some mentors will say my role is to make sure that you achieve whatever you're hoping to get out of grad school. So I think that kind of question gives you a lot of good insights. But at the end of the day, I think looking for someone who graduate students feel like they can actually have open communication with that advisor, and the advisor actually listens and accommodates different perspectives, different personalities, will set you on a really good path. And then you can feel more comfortable adjusting and making changes in the relationship as it evolves naturally.
There was a question, so I'm going to change the direction a little bit. So it's about the, sort of your qualification and application process. So many undergraduates, including myself, don't have any publications and have done maybe 1 or 2 poster presentations at most. With that being said, what kinds of other things do you recommend to include on a CV, and should they be categorized?
Well, I mean, I think the poster presentations, that's still valuable. And I think like on a CV, also including, what your roles are in that research, given that you're presenting posters. But, publications can also take a while to come out. So maybe when you're applying, you don't have those on your CV. But I mean, when I'm looking at applications, I look at the CV. I also look at the rest of the package as well. And the personal statement, and in those you can also talk about how you've been involved in the research. So what are the aspects of the projects that you've been involved in? And that actually is hard to get from publications, but it gives me a better sense of what kind of experience you've had in the past. I don't know if Joanne, you have an answer to that.
And the common CVs, you can also include your work experience. It doesn't have to only focus on your academic work experience or your research experience. And typically students do separate them out. So there will be sort of research component on your CV, and then there's sort of the general work experience component to your CV. So I think all those things are fine. I toss it onto grad students.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think along the lines of what Joanne was saying, especially if you're applying for a lab where you're going to be doing data collection, especially with sensitive populations, customer service experiences are so valuable. I have a lot better time training undergrads who have customer experience. So I think adding that and also explaining why that's relevant to the research, if you don't have as much of like the publications and stuff like that, that's also like a huge strength actually. I would also, for my grad school application, I don't know if this is good or not, but I did a bit of a hybrid CV resume style. So I had the experience listed like research assistant, X lab, this PI, and I actually included a few bullet points of specifically what I did and what skills I used. So like active tense, like analyzed X data in this format using this program. So that hybrid system, like A, kind of makes it look a little bit longer, and B, really helps people who maybe don't want to read 2 pages to get a sense of your skills. So that's another thing to consider.
Yeah, and specifically for clinical work, kind of what Aaliyah was saying, if you have experiences where you're helping collect data with a clinical population or other relevant experiences, I think that's important to put on your CV. And then if you're interested in that kind of work, include that as well in your personal statements.
And if I may add one, but this, I'm not going to necessarily generalize this to entire faculty population because I don't think that's the reality. But the way that I look at applications and the way I go about picking my own grad students is I kind of want to know the student as a whole person. I'm not looking at the student just as, I mean, I guess a grad student, but I'm not saying that you need to spill your guts and tell me your life story, but let's say, there are cases where the students may not have had as much research experience, maybe because they had to work full time while going to school, right? So that kind of information can also be quite useful. And as Aaliyah was saying, sometimes the maturity, the leadership that you may think is not directly related to research or academia can actually translate quite well into graduate school. So my advice will be don't leave those things out if you have them. I think it's totally okay to put it on your CV.
Okay, so let's see. I was gonna, another question that was submitted earlier was, or before the session was, would it benefit to visit the graduate school in person? And I think, or to get a better sense of the environment. It definitely does, I think. But it usually, I think the way that the application process is going to vary across schools, but at least that we've done at UT in the last couple of years is that kind of the first interviews, a lot of them are virtual, and then there's the opportunity to come and visit. I don't know if I think that's the way that they're planning on doing it again, Joanne. I don't know, or Kimberly, if you know. But I think it's really important to go and visit the institution, to visit and talk with the people that you are going to be working with, not only the advisor, but the graduate students, also to see where you're going to be living for the next couple of years. But so that's my 2 cents. What do you think, McKenna?
Well, so I was just gonna say I applied all virtually, so all of our interviews and everything were all on Zoom, and I think it's really difficult to get a good sense of what life is like in that city, at that university, and with the people there. I think UT did a really good job of trying to give you opportunities to talk with students, but it's different when you're in a Zoom room trying to get those, like, the information about kind of the day-to-day in labs and in Austin. And so, yeah, I definitely think even if it is virtual again in the future, I know what some of the people who applied this past cycle did was if they got an offer from maybe 2 schools that they were deciding between before they accepted one or the other, they were able to travel to those places, and then I would get coffee or something with someone who was maybe going to come. So if you have the means, even if things are virtual, to be able to, after the fact, if you're trying to decide if you're able to go visit that place, I think it can be really helpful. But then if things are virtual, I think it's just making the most of it and being able to ask questions, even if it feels weird because you're a box on a Zoom screen, just to try to get as much of a sense as you can about the daily life, both in the workplace and outside of it.
Yeah, I totally agree with the sentiments. I would add just a quick clarification. I don't think you should come before you get an offer. That's something that like I know some people who like apply straight out of undergrad, you're kind of more used to doing tours, seeing if it's the right fit or whatever. I would, if it's a place that you like off the bat, no, you can't live in for whatever reason, I wouldn't apply in the first place. But if it's a place you think on paper you'd be willing to live in and consider moving to, I would apply, go through the interview process, because oftentimes they'll pay for you to come and visit. So that way you save the hassle. And also, if you don't end up getting an offer, then I wouldn't waste the funds personally. Also, if they do things virtually again for COVID reasons, don't be scared to reach out to the PI who made you an offer and see if there's any room to pay for you to come to visit. Sometimes they have discretionary funds that can subsidize your flight, that can help with accommodations. They can maybe have a grad student host you. So if you don't necessarily have the means to fly yourself to another city and stay for a couple of days, don't be scared to reach out. That's very normal. And a lot of PIs will make an effort to make sure that you can come and visit.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying it. Definitely after it would be somewhere that you've got an offer from. And I do just want to add, so I didn't go to any of the places that I had applied to, and I hadn't even been to Texas before coming here. And I think a lot of that, again, is just being able to make the most of the virtual experience, and two, picking places that you could see yourself going. And so it is okay to not, if you're not able to go, it's not the end of the world. And I feel like for me that worked out okay. But yeah, just again, trying to figure out what's best for you in terms of your decision making and where you want to end up for the next 5 years.
Okay, I'm just gonna keep moving through questions, hopefully we can cover a lot. So one other question was kind of related to master's program. So is it possible to skip a master's program and go right into a PhD program? And then there were several kind of questions related to the financial aspect. So I think some of this was covered in the first session about funding, where the PhD programs are, you're fully funded. That's not necessarily the case with the master's program. And generally, if you want a PhD, my recommendation is don't just do a master's and then go to a PhD. Sometimes you can get a master's along the way, depending on the program. But if your ultimate goal is to get a PhD for whatever reason, depending on kind of your career goals, there's no need to get a master's degree. And financially, that may not be beneficial, because more often than not, master's degrees require you have to fund yourself. They're not, it's infrequent that they are also subsidized by the program. So, it really is, what do you need to get where you want to be in terms of your career goals? And if it is a PhD, there's just no need to go for the master's program. What do you think, Joanne?
I agree. But there are some, and I think it really comes down to the individual. There are some cases where the students may not have had the opportunity to really, do research while in undergrad, or maybe their interest in graduate school sort of developed towards the end of their undergraduate career. And then for some students, they have the ability to take gap year and maybe work as, research technician or lab manager. But for some students, that may not be the option. And if they have the financial ability and time to do it, I have seen students who do go to master's program with the intention of building their sort of research background and their CV, not necessarily because it is a necessary step towards applying to PhD. But in general, I'm also, I'm very aware of the financial burden that comes with, having to go, fund yourself through education. So if possible, I think, I guess I'll just say that, yes, master's program is not necessary to be a competitive candidate for a PhD program.
Right. I think it does depend on the individual, and if you see a master's. Master's is not, obtaining a master's is not the only way that you can build your CV and resume with research experience. I think there are other ways you can do it, all things being equal, where you could, if you were going to go be a research technician during your gap year, you could actually get paid, get the experience, rather than the alternative, which is going and getting a master's, which, in contrast, you're paying and getting research experience. So it does depend on kind of the individual and what their situation is like, but like Joanne said, it's not necessary. And if the intent is to build your resume in terms of research experience, I think there are better ways that you can do that. Do the grad students have any thoughts on this? Is this something that either one of you considered, or do you have anything to add, Aaliyah or McKenna?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify in case there are international students or people coming not as familiar with the US education system. In the US education system, there's a 5-year PhD program, and that's kind of the only format really. Then the way it's designed is that the first 2 years are quasi your master's. So you're taking a lot of classes those first 2 years, you're still doing research, and then you go into candidacy, in which the last 3 years are like more the European version of a PhD program, where you're not taking classes and you're just full-time doing research and TAing for funding if need be. So that kind of structure means that even if you did have a master's prior to coming into a PhD program, you're still doing the full 5 years. You're still retaking all those classes or taking different classes, but it doesn't like save you time as like in different countries, it would save you time. So I think in Europe, that's pretty standard. Australia, that's pretty standard. You would do the master's and then have those 3 years. So that's just like a clarification in case people aren't as familiar with the US education system. In terms of if you are really interested in the US, I would personally absolutely advise as a first pass, if you're mainly interested in a master's for research building experiences, to try and apply for lab manager positions, project managers, clinical research coordinators are great roles for people who want to go into the clinical realm. There's a lot of really great positions where you're doing research full time and you're getting paid for it. So I would absolutely encourage that as a first pass. And then if for whatever reason that doesn't work out, or you are specifically interested in a master's, I would do the master's, and also potentially doing a master's in more quantitative stuff, even if you are interested in psychology. If you have your undergrad in psychology, there's I think a really cool benefit to doing a master's in more of the quantitative side. So you have a really strong statistical background. And I think that'll actually give you a huge advantage when then applying back into neuroscience or psychology programs. So that's another like alternative combo to consider.
McKenna, anything to add? I think we covered it, but I just want to make sure. I don't know if you had anything.
Yeah, nothing to add. I just echoing all of that.
Okay. So there was another question, and I don't know how many folks this applies to, but about, let's see, basically pursuing a medical degree at the same time as a PhD, so an MD PhD. That process I'm not as familiar with. This is we're in the Department of Psychology, but that is something that you can pursue, that many institutions do offer. That is typically that the structure of that is something in which you specifically apply to MD PhD programs, and you attend. The first 2 years are in medical school, and then the next, I think, every 3 years you're doing your PhD. So it's in a kind of abbreviated PhD, and then I don't know, it's another 2 or 3 years where you're going back and finishing medical school. So it's long, it is longer, but you're getting both kind of the training that you would receive during medical school while getting the kind of research experience. And those individuals tend to, they practice medicine, but they also have a research component to their career. But that's also something, if you I would advise looking into those programs if you really want to continue to practice, if you want to practice medicine while doing research. I haven't really worked with many students that are on that track. So I can't really speak to that. I don't know if you know of anyone, Joanne, but if you're really interested in doing both, I've had some undergrads that are interested in that, continuing to do research, but sometimes they can find research or opportunities during medical school, and that's how they get involved.
Yeah, and just to clarify, that is usually through medical school. So if you're interested in MD, PhD, a standalone PhD program won't have that. So usually they're in partnership with medical school, and the whole application process goes through the medical school. So, and then once you are accepted into the program, to the MD, PhD program through the medical school, you will be then, partner with a lab in the usually same institution to do the PhD.
I did see a question. Is it possible? Are there application waivers from the department? Joanne, do you know that? Because I don't actually. Yes.
Well, instead of doing this, I should probably let Kimberly do it. It's at the university level, I think.
Okay.
Yes, so we do offer them. Information is on our website as to how to apply for one of those.
Great. Okay, so I wanted to, I know there was a question in the chat, and we can get to that, but I also wanted to talk about the personal statement. There was a few questions about the personal statement in the questions that we were sent ahead of time. So what to put in the personal statement that stands out. So before I kind of give you my 2 cents, because I find myself talking a lot, I wanted to see if McKenna, especially because she did this more recently, maybe she could talk about how what her strategy was in writing a personal statement for her PhD applications.
Yeah, definitely. So all the programs are going to have somewhat similar requirements, but I think they are specific to each program, and you absolutely want your personal statement to be specific to the program you're applying to. So I think I had an initial draft of my personal statement, and I had the faculty member I was working at my undergrad institution with, I had him read over it and definitely getting advice on it. And then I think depending on the programs, I tended to kind of have 2 types of drafts. You have a longer one. So some programs will have word counts that are more like 1,000. And then some programs will have only a 500 word statement, which I find is much more difficult because that's not a lot that you can fit into 500 words. And then from there, I think for each program, you just want to make sure that you're hitting all of the requirements that they talk about. So some places had a diversity requirement. They wanted you to include that in your statement or have a separate one, or certain things they want you to highlight. So definitely making sure that you're following all of those guidelines. And then from there, I think having a section that for each school you apply to, you're putting in specific names of faculty you want to work with, their interests, why those align with yours. And then throughout, I think the biggest thing is just kind of taking all of the other information that they're getting on your CV and your transcripts and kind of weaving it into a story of, okay, here's what I've done and here's what's guided me to my interests, why your school is a good fit for that. And then once I'm able to get there, what I want to do with it are kind of the big things you want to hit.
Just as a quick commentary, because when I was reviewing personal statements, I think last year or 2 years ago, something that people don't mention as much as I wish they did is more explicitly what they want to do in grad school and what research they're seeing themselves wanting to do. So that's, I think in undergrad, when I wrote my personal statements, it was more about like a narrative and who I am as a person and like all these kinds of things. But this personal statement actually goes to a direct PI, like that the person you specifically applied to, assuming it's not a rotation program, if it's a program you're applying to a specific person. So that's the person who's reading the statement. So make sure that when you're reading it or writing it, that you also kind of make sure that you're really hitting why your research is relevant to them, what you're seeing, what you see yourself wanting to should do long-term and how it's a really good partnership. I think that tends to really stick out to PIs when they're like, oh, like they know my research really well. They have already explained to me why their experience is relevant to me and what we could work on together in the future. So that's something that people sometimes forget to do, but it can go a really long way.
Yeah, I think that's an important part to highlight, because you're obviously applying to graduate school to gain additional training. So of course we want to know about your experience, what your qualifications are, but we also want to know why you're applying to graduate school. What do you see yourself doing there? How do your research interests align with our research interests, and what can you gain from the program? And so that does mean that you may have to tailor your statements to different schools, but it does go a long way. And it tells me, for example, that you actually put a lot of thought into why you are applying to graduate school, why this program, why this lab. And some of the questions that I asked during interviews is, well, why do you want to work with me? Why did you pick this lab institution? And those are things that you can very easily lay out in your personal statement, and that is very appealing. So I think it's worth to take the time to craft tailored applications and then get feedback, like McKenna was saying, get feedback from several people, and that different eyes on kind of any written document is really helpful.
Speaking of which, there's a lot of, or not a lot, there's a few programs that actually have office hours for people who are applying to grad school. I will try to think of the names, and then maybe Joanne can send out like a blast email. But our department has one of those that we usually share through Twitter. And I think the University of Colorado, maybe Denver, I don't remember which one, they also have a bigger one. So you actually get matched with a current grad student or faculty, and they review your application. So that's a really cool resource for people who might want an extra pair of eyes.
Kaylin, can you, there are a couple of questions that popped up. So one about looking for APA approved programs versus not. And then there's a little more specific questions about forensic psychology and some internship that they are having. If I just may address that, forensic part, our program itself doesn't have forensic psychology, but if the internship that you are having through the police department is something that is relevant for what you need to do, I think those are also very valuable experience. Then Kaylin, I'm just going to ask you to address the APA approved programs versus not.
So I think, well, I don't really know a good answer to that. But
I mean, I think it generally maybe, addresses like, you want to make sure that the program you're applying to is accredited. And,
yes.
it is sort of, I guess, legit program.
Yeah, okay. I was frowning because organization approved programs. I think, yeah, so you should be looking for accredited programs, and some of the best ways just to look for programs are through the major universities, or you can even look, there are a lot of resources online, but the main thing is you want to look for accredited or APA approved programs, and that's particularly the case for like clinical programs. You want them to be APA approved or accredited, because eventually you'll go on for licensing. Hopefully that addresses that question.
So
yeah, and I would just add, I know there are other accreditations, but I think from my understanding, the way things are now, I don't I personally wouldn't have felt comfortable doing a program that didn't have the APA accreditation. I just think it holds so much weight right now in terms of internships and licensing and everything.
Yeah.
So and most programs are, it's not like it's really difficult to find APA accredited programs. So I would stick with that.
So it's noon now. So Caitlin, is there another topic that you want to address before we
think
finish this?
I think we covered kind of many of the big ones based on the questions that were submitted ahead of time. I would be happy to answer any other questions, and I'm assuming McKenna and maybe Aaliyah would as well. So I can put in my contact information in the chat if they want to do that as well. I don't want to take up any more of your Saturdays, but hopefully this was helpful. But if there are any lingering questions or questions that you have after you kind of digest all of this information, feel free to email me or us, and I'd be happy to answer those.
Okay, so I'm going to stop the recording.